But he is related to Rommel. Yeah, opposite sides, yeah? Look, Polish, German, Polish. Okay, Prussian. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. January 30th, 1942. American Commander Douglas MacArthur tells Washington that there is no more room for maneuvers and he is going to fight until complete destruction. The troops have this to say about their situation. We're the battling bastards of Bataan. No mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam. No aunts, no uncles, no nephews, no nieces, no rifles, no planes or artillery pieces, and nobody gives a damn. Well, that's not true. Washington does give a damn. They just can't send any relief. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week at a conference in a Berlin suburb, German leaders decided on their final solution to what they call the Jewish question. It involves murdering them. In North Africa, Erwin Rommel launched an offensive that took the Allies by surprise. The Soviets were advancing, but getting orders that took the generals by surprise. And in Southeast Asia, to no one's surprise, the Japanese continued their advances everywhere, as they do this week in the Philippines. On the 24th, the American and Filipino forces in Bataan Peninsula begin withdrawal from the Abu Kai defense line. That night, the Japanese land at Point Langoskayan, south of the American defenses. This is another attempt, like that of the 22nd, to cut the West Coast road. Fighting is fierce all week, but the Japanese are defeated by the end of the week. This is also part of the Battle of the Points. The Japanese have, though, thanks to the thick jungle, managed to form two pockets behind the Filipino-American lines. And fighting develops in the Battle of the Pockets as this week rolls along, with a big counterattack beginning the 29th. MacArthur's retreating forces reach the Pilar Bagak Road the 25th, but the Japanese close in by the 26th. They are losing faith, however, in a rapid conquest of Bataan, and soon pull back to a better defensive line of their own and ask Manila for reinforcements. But morale on the American and Filipino side is way worse, of course. They've not only had to pull back under constant bombardment, but malaria is rampant. MacArthur's headquarters and home is the Malinta Tunnel. Well, it's a tunnel complex on Corregidor, and the mood there is just grim, hence things like the poem. Apparently, Frank Hewlett, the sole war correspondent there, wrote that poem, and the original fourth line is, "No pills, no planes, no artillery pieces," which makes sense with the malaria, I guess. Overhead, bombs fell thick and fast on Corregidor. No friendly planes appeared, and the radio broadcasts that were picked up from the United States reporting how MacArthur was inflicting heavy casualties on the Japanese rang as hollow and depressing as the constant stream of assurances from the War Department that aid was coming. Nightly, the sinister voice of Tokyo rose, broadcast on the radio, promising General MacArthur that he would be paraded in the streets of the Japanese capital before the month was out. Washington has known for weeks, since the decision to make a Europe-first strategy, that it pretty much mandated the loss of the Philippines. MacArthur's continued defense is important, though, to give the Americans a little breathing space to send forces to stop Japan's southward attacks and defend the East Indies or Australia. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, drew a line on a map from Midway Island through Samoa, through Fiji, and then to Brisbane, and told Pacific Fleet Commander Chester Nimitz to hold it at all costs. Back on the 6th, the carrier Yorktown was sent from San Diego with men and planes for the Samoan garrison. Those troops land this week on the 24th. There's another convoy of 20,000 men sent to garrison New Caledonia in the New Hebrides. King is seriously concerned about threats to communications with Australia and New Zealand, and he orders Nimitz to send a heavy cruiser and the carrier Lexington, when it's available, to the Coral Sea to join the two Australian cruisers there under Admiral John Crace. Nimitz has issues with this, though, because he's already short of ships to guard the convoys between Hawaii and the mainland U.S. and to protect the Western Pacific. and isn't thrilled to dilute his force to protect the approaches to Australia. And his plan is still to send carrier task forces to attack Japanese island bases. Even after the carrier Saratoga was torpedoed 2 weeks ago and has to be repaired, which takes away a quarter of his carrier strength, he's still going to do this. So on the 25th, both the Enterprise and Yorktown task forces head north to soon attack the Japanese in the Marshall and Makin Islands. Already the 24th, though, American destroyers successfully attack Japanese transports off Balikpapan. The transports are unprotected because a Dutch submarine turning up had drawn away their destroyer escorts on a hunt. They're also lit up against the fiery oil tanks ashore. The destroyers arrive and blast away, sinking 4 transports and a patrol boat. This is not only the first American naval victory of the war, it is the first surface action the U.S. Navy has had since 1898 at Manila. In the Great War, the U.S. Navy only encountered submarines, and Pearl Harbor was not a surface action either. However, with only those transports sunk, the invasion of Borneo is not delayed at all. There are Japanese attacks all over this week. On the 25th, they invade the Solomon Islands. On the 30th, they begin attacks on Mole Mine in Burma. That same day, they attack Amboina in the Dutch East Indies. On the 28th, they land on Russell Island, east of New Guinea. The Japanese threat to Australia is now a very real one. The Australians are also very concerned about the possible loss of Singapore. On the 25th, Arthur Percival orders the final retreat of the Malayan forces to Singapore Island. Thousands of British and Imperial soldiers will cross the kilometer-long causeway this week from Johor to Singapore. Now, Japanese commander Tomoyuki Yamashita wants to take the causeway, but his logistics have finally been too stretched and do not allow it. He's given a third of his air power to the attacks planned for Sumatra, and his tanks are too depleted for the task. He does manage to land some planes on the East Malayan coast at Endau the 26th. The British then send up 74 mostly obsolete planes against 22 modern Japanese ones. The Japanese lose 1 plane, the British 17. The next day, the carrier Indomitable brings 48 fighters to Java to hopefully fly to Singapore to reinforce. As for the fighting in Malaya the past 7 weeks, according to the best figures available, casualties in Malaya Command up to the battle on Singapore Island numbered 19,123. Japanese losses were 1,793 dead and 2,772 wounded. At dawn, February 1st, so 2 mornings from now, soldiers of the 2nd Battalion of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders will cross the causeway. At 8 a.m., the engineers will dynamite the causeway. When the dust and smoke of the explosion settled, Singapore appeared to be again a true island, cut off by the muddy waters of the Johor Strait flowing through a wide open gap. Yet this too, like the fortress itself, was symbolic. The weight of explosives had been miscalculated. Water only covered the displaced rubble to a depth of less than 4 feet, shallow enough at low tide for even the shortest Japanese soldier to wade across. Well, any invasion of Singapore is in the future. But attacks going on right now are happening in North Africa. As we saw, Erwin Rommel launched a spoiler attack last week on the Allies, but he has some command issues as this week gets going with his commander-in-chief. Bastico, thoroughly alarmed at the way in which a spoiling attack was developing into a full-scale offensive, had complained to Rome, where Mussolini's reaction was a directive expressly forbidding a major advance. Rommel's reply was to the effect that, as Germans were doing most of the fighting, only Hitler could stop him, and he went on with the battle. The advance resumes the 25th, reaching Massus that day, and Alfred Godwin Austin orders the 4th Indian Division from 13th Corps to evacuate Benghazi. Rommel then calls a halt for 36 hours to bring up fuel and think what his next moves will be. He's definitely blown Allied hopes and plans for any offensive in the next month or 3, but has to decide between heading for Benghazi or doing what he did last year and making a cross-desert advance. He decides against the latter, since that would open his supply lines to attack from Benghazi. But when he learns that Benghazi might be given up, decides to deceive the enemy, by feinting towards Kyhle and then attacking Benghazi by an unexpected direction, forcing a crossing of the Badlands and hitting it from the north along the coast. British 8th Army Commander Neil Ritchie cancels Godwin Austen's evacuation of Benghazi, since he thinks Rommel can be driven back without undue effort. Godwin Austen protests vigorously, but to no avail, and Ritchie orders Francis Tucker, in direct command of the 4th Indian, to ensure his orders, and prepares to attack Rommel's feint the 29th. When Rommel attacks towards Benghazi the 28th, the Allies are, however, just able to escape the trap. Benghazi falls the 29th, though Rommel is too short of fuel to pursue the enemy further. The Germans are on the defense, though, in the Soviet Union, though even after days and days of fighting, the vital railway at Sychovka stays in German hands. This week, the Red Cavalry is also unable to beat the German garrison at Vyazma. Maxim Perkayev's 3rd Soviet Shock Army is coming to a halt before Veliki Luki. The flanks of Andrei Yeremenko's 4th are exposed. The German 3rd Panzer Army is moving in to support the beleaguered 9th and 16th armies. The Soviets are short of ammunition, food, fuel, and men, and the Germans are fighting back. The temperature reaches its lowest point of the month on the 26th, minus 52 degrees Celsius. That's minus 65 Fahrenheit. Average January temperatures near Moscow have been in the mid-minus 30s. That's on both scales. They converge at minus 40. But the Soviets are sending in more men by the skies, as they've done all month. On the 27th, 4th Corps drops paratroopers west of Vyazma. 476 of 638 men dropped reached their units. The next night, though, German bombers hit the Kaluga airfields where the 4th Corps operates from. But despite the destruction of aircraft and fuel, over a 6-day period, 2,232 men are dropped in, though just 1,320 managed to form their units. The Red Army does manage to retake Sukhinichi, southwest of Kaluga this week, though. In the north, however, the situation is different. The Soviet advance had completely stalled, but the night of the 24th, the 2nd Shock Army manages to break a hole in the German defenses, and ski battalions, cavalry, and armor begin racing through it. Their orders are to widen the gap and attack towards Lyuban. Thing is, the front had been like 20 kilometers wide, but the gap is only like 1. Front commander Kirill Meretskov thinks he's getting a new army from Stavka, but one doesn't turn up, and the German rear defenses are tenacious, but the Soviets keep powering through until the attack becomes a long line with exposed flanks and terrible supply and communications. On the 28th, General Krylev of Rear Services comes to get logistics in order. Once the 2nd Shock Army is through the gap, the 52nd and 59th Armies will have the job of widening it, driving from opposite ends down the Novgorod-Chudovo road. We'll see how that goes. On the 24th, Semyon Timoshenko explains his plans for the far south to Stavka. The 57th and 37th Armies would continue to try to break through, now with the 9th Army as well, but he would also try to outflank and take Kharkov from the south and southwest. Stavka wants him to take the west bank of the Dnieper as well, and to also drive south to a position west of Mariupol. They actually give him some decent reinforcements to do this. On the 26th, his forces reach the Orel River. The 27th, they capture Lozovaya, but no real headway is made against the German stronghold of Kharkov. And here are some notes to end the week. On the 25th, Thailand declares war on the United States and Britain. On the 26th, the first U.S. troops arrive in Ulster. Irish Prime Minister Eamon de Valera protests vigorously. Also that day, a Pearl Harbor Board of Inquiry released their findings. Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter Short are charged with dereliction of duty. On the 29th, Britain and the USSR sign an alliance with Iran. On the 30th, Adolf Hitler speaks again at the Sportspalast and tells the Jews of the world he's going to annihilate them. He also blames German failures in the USSR on the weather. This date is the 9th anniversary of his rise to power. And the week comes to an end, with an American retreat in the Philippines and an American attack at sea, with German advances in North Africa, but then a halt to consolidate, Soviet successes and failures in the USSR, and ever more Japanese conquests in ever more nations. They're really closing in on Singapore. And if it should fall, this is the major British base in the whole region, a top prize and a huge black eye for the British, and a great jumping off point for attacks on the Dutch East Indies and points beyond. The Japanese had far fewer forces attacking Malaya than the defenders had 7 weeks ago, and they've still advanced down the whole peninsula. Should Singapore fall, can anything stop the Japanese? To find out the answer, ahead of the pack, join the Time Ghost Army and get our content early. To learn more about the Dutch East Indies in the 1940s, check out our mini-series on the Indonesian War of Independence. Part 1 is right here. Our Time Ghost Army member of the week is Colin Skelton. It is the army that finances all of our content. You can join at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you next time.